So I would like to read the story on which I base my message today. It's a story that has been very significant throughout history. You find it in the Bible, in the first book of the Bible, Genesis 2:25. It's only one verse from Genesis 2, and then Genesis 3:1-7. The story in Genesis 2 is typically called the story of paradise, and then in Genesis 3, the so-called story of the fall. So let me read this story, and it's very important that I start with the end of the story of paradise. So there it says in verse 25, chapter 2, and the two of them, the man and his wife, were naked, and they were not ashamed of it. Now the serpent was more cunning than any living being of the field that Yahweh, the God, had made. The serpent said to the woman, "Did God really say, 'Do not eat from any of the trees of the garden'?" The woman corrected the serpent, "Oh, we may eat from the fruit of the trees of the garden, but only of the fruit of the tree which stands in the middle of the garden. God has said, 'Do not eat from it, nor touch it. Otherwise, you must die.' The serpent replied to the woman, 'No, no, you will not die. Rather, God knows that the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' The woman then saw that the tree was good to eat from, and that it was a lust to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired for grasping. She took from its fruit and ate, and she gave her husband, who was with her as well, and he ate. The eyes of both were opened, and they became aware that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made loincloth for themselves. Friends, this story is one of the most consequential stories in the history of the world. It has been used, like perhaps only the crucifixion story, to impose tremendous amounts of suffering in this world. Emotionally, spiritually, culturally. And I want to go into why I believe this is. I invite you this morning that you put yourselves into the shoe of the characters in this story, specifically of the woman and the man. And I want to invite you to not worry about who is the woman or who is the man. Both of them are representing human beings. And I invite you to connect the story of these human beings with your own experiences of loss, of fear, of pain, of death, of sickness, of nothingness. All of these are nothingness. This story deals with our limitations and what happens to us and to our view of God when we are faced with limitations. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that stories like this in the Bible are not objective accounts of God. One of the things that has been used to oppress people personally and socially is that the Bible has been taken to provide objective accounts of God, descriptions of God, as if every single time that the word God is mentioned or that God does or says something in the Bible, that it means this is how God really is. What I want to suggest to you is that this is not actually what the Bible is portraying to us. What the Bible is portraying to us are a series of stories that show human beings wrestling with the idea of God. Human beings trying to find a God who can absolutely hold them when they become aware of their finiteness, of all these things that I just mentioned: sickness, death, loss. How can we, in the face of all of these things, not feel decimated to nothing? How can we have a ground to stand on when everything disappears or seems to disappear? That is when we first look for God. Anthropologists suggest that there are many reasons why we have come up with the idea of God, but among them is that when we buried people, we started believing that there is more to the love we experienced than the death that is taking them away. Now, in this story, Genesis 3, we are witnessing an experience after there has been bliss. It's very important to point out that context. The reason why I read verse 25 from chapter 2 from the paradise story is because it says that we are naked and we are not ashamed of ourselves. Again, remember, read this as your story. We become aware of our limitations and we are not ashamed of it. We become aware of death, and it is not the big problem that we often feel it is. But when we have had experiences of fullness, when we have felt nurtured, and this is what babies already experience. We all were babies at one point. Experiences of fear emerge as well. And the fear is that this nurture, this sense of fullness will come to an end. We are afraid that we will lose that and that in the process we will be reduced to that loss. And that is the voice of the serpent. The voice of the serpent is the voice of fear and the voice of the scarcity principle. The voice of the serpent says in this text, did God really say, do not eat from any of the trees of the garden? Now, friends, did God say that in Genesis 2? No, God did not say that in Genesis 2. In fact, God said the exact opposite. And the woman is very careful to defend God. What had God said? The woman tells us partly what God had said. God had said, you may eat from all of the trees of the garden, except from that one tree. Don't eat from that, because on the day that you eat from it, you will die. Now, what the woman does too there, and remember, we can just say the human being here. And I'm saying that because the story has been used to oppress women in patriarchal ways. This is not about the woman. The woman is just a character in the story. But what she says here, representative for us as human beings, is, no, that's not true. But then she adds a taboo of touching. Now, if you think of yourself as saying, let's use a simple example. You don't want to eat more candy, right? But you find yourself, this is just such good candy. You say, I can't really stop myself. So you may put it away. You might try to hide it. You're trying to put a taboo on it because you're afraid that you will keep eating it. This is the similar dynamic that is at play in addictions. In addictions, people often feel they don't want to do this, but then they find themselves doing it again. And so the taboo serves as a sort of pep talk to oneself. No, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to do that. Now, what that taboo, though, shows in this story is that the fear that the serpent brought up, that everything will be disappearing, that nothing nurturing will be there, that the world is not a loving place, that everything is off limits, that fear had an impact. That fear kind of infected us as humans. Sometimes when I work with people as a counselor, I see how they're struggling with self-esteem. And as they're struggling with self-esteem, a lot of negative voices come up that say, oh, you're nobody, you're nothing, or you'll fail again anyway. And this fear keeps going. And when that fear is there are often attempts. No, I'm not going to do that again. I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to kind of pull myself up by the bootstraps. The fear has infected us as humans when the voice of the serpent comes up. Now, one thing that's very significant in the story, in the very first verse, it says, the voice itself is not the problem. It says the serpent is created by God. That means not that God wanted to inflict us with something or tempt us with something. It just means the awareness of our limitations will always be there. The awareness that we are naked will always be there, because there's something very fascinating about the description of the serpent. The word that this text describes the serpent with is as cunning. And the Hebrew word for cunning has the same root as the Hebrew word for naked. The serpent represents our nakedness, our experience of our nakedness, and the fear that it brings up. Nakedness is not that, here I'm naked in sort of a physical way. These are symbolic things. Religious texts are symbolic stories. They're not about biologically eating a fruit or anything like that. It's about symbolic stories, and the nakedness has to do with our experience of limitedness, limitations. And what our mind can unfortunately do is our mind can, the psychologists talk of catastrophizing. There will be never anything good. I'll always be bad. That's called catastrophizing. But what that points to is we have in our mind actually an ability to what I call infinitize. We can infinitize fear. We can make it go out of proportion. And that is what happens when the serpent starts talking. The fear of being reduced to what the serpent says, the fear that we are reduced to the limitations, is what sets the rest of the trajectory of the story. Once we are infected by this virus of fear, if we want to use a current metaphor, what happens to our view of God? At that point, the voice said, the view of God has been clouded by fear. This is what happens in Genesis 3. It's a story that teaches us that how we lose sight of the God of fullness and see God not as a God of fullness and of love, but as an ultimate depriver. In fact, as a competitor for us. When the source of love and the source of life is seen through the lens of scarcity, it becomes our enemy. And then, only then, are we trying to replace that source of life with our own efforts. Now, the serpent in the story at that point says, no, you will not die. Rather, God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. We only are susceptible to this kind of idea that God has forbidden things from us, that we need to be our own God, or to translate it into other language, we only need to be selfish when we have lost our sense of self. We only need to grasp for something in the world to replace the absolute sense of footing that we lost when we have lost it. We only need to play God when we don't feel loved. We only need to play God when we fear that there will ultimately be no nurture that will be feeding us when we're afraid of death, of limitations, of our nakedness. Now, when God is lost in this fantasy of fear that is in complete contrast to the God in Genesis 2 that walked with humans, where they enjoyed each other, where they love each other, where they feel full. When God is lost in that fantasy of fear, only then the tree becomes desirable. Only then does that one fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden become the source of all hope. Now, of course, there's a big question. What is this fruit? What does that mean? In this question of in the language of the serpent, why did God deprive us of that? When we think that way, we are already caught up in the scarcity principle. If you are a parent, or if you were a child, and you remember, I once had my children, they wanted to walk on top of there was a bridge, and there was a wall where you could step on top. It was near the canal here in Indianapolis. And they wanted to climb on top and walk on that, right? And so I would tell my children, please don't walk on that. Please don't run on that. You're going to fall into the canal. Now, when I say something like that, that is not a depriving commandment where I say you should never have any exciting stuff going on. Instead, I don't want them to die. And I don't want them to be in misery. The commandment, or actually the way Jewish theologians like Martin Buber would translate this, it's not a commandment, it's not a prohibition in the sense of a law. It's that's just not a good idea. You're going to hurt yourself. Now, what we need to understand what that means, but we only understand if we understand what the knowledge of good and evil is. Because here is the important point why I read the last verse of Genesis 2:25. And now this, what is the knowledge of good and evil? The knowledge of good and evil is once they have taken the fruit, it says in verse 7, the eyes of both were opened and they became aware that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made loincloth for themselves. Isn't that fascinating? They became aware of being naked again. It's very important to point out that this is not a new knowledge. The content of what they realize is not new, but the way they realize it is new. Now they feel naked and they are ashamed of it. When we are feeling held and nurtured, it's fine to be vulnerable. We are not ashamed of it. In love, when you've had experiences of love where you can trust somebody, they will be fine with your limitations. That's what true love is. It doesn't matter that you have limitations, because on some level we supplement each other, we help each other around our limitations. And the nakedness is not a problem. But when fear envelops us, when fear gets the better of us, and when we are reduced to fear, then we try to fill ourselves, fill our nakedness, fill up our finitude, fill out our sense of nothingness with all kinds of things in the world that can never really satisfy that. And then we feel inadequate. We feel naked because our efforts have failed to fill us with the kind of nurture that really only absolute love can satisfy. it is very important that we realize that this is a story of despair. I'm emphasizing that so strongly because, friends, the reason why the story is so consequential and has been used in such harmful ways is that the focus was on, oh, we as human beings at one point in the long distant past grabbed some fruit, and that was an act of disobedience. This is what is underlying the notion of so-called original sin. This is what churches have built their power on when they tell people that their desires are evil. Many of our cultural conflicts have to do with a fight against human desire. A lot of the conflicts around sexuality are rooted in the interpretation of this story as humans wanting to be inordinately satisfying themselves. The taboo that the woman added in the story has been read to, oh, this is a story about sexuality and inappropriate sexuality, and God is kind of squelching at us, throwing us out of paradise. Sexual morality has been shaped around this story. Christian sexual morality has been imported then to other cultures. Colonialism was justified with these kinds of interpretations of this story. And most importantly, folks, the story has been used to say God has to break our will because we willfully transgressed. What I invite you, friends, to do is to read this story no longer as a story of transgression, but as a story of despair, where we as human beings are grasping for straws when we are in a hell of fear. And what happens is that when we read this story instead of, oh, this is how God really is, what we're doing actually is we're believing the voice of the serpent. And I have to say this very clearly, friends. The church has very often believed the story of the serpent and has almost acted like the serpent, has given us fruits in terms of doctrines, and then has thrown us out of paradise. God does not throw us out of paradise. The baseline of life, the stories of Genesis 2 and 3 suggest, is the story of paradise. Paradise is not something that happens after this life. Paradise is the baseline of our life. When we believe that we are rooted in God, at that point, there is paradise. That, there's the story of the jar of the prophet Elijah when he is all famished. And there is the jar that will never end. There's so many stories in the Bible where God shows up as the one who puts an end to the scarcity principle. Death, where is thy sting? There's so many other stories. And the story of Jesus and the Last Supper, I know in the Christian church, in some traditions, the story of the Last Supper is not a big deal. But the reason why holy meals are significant is they symbolize whenever we are hungry in a way that no limited thing can satisfy, there is nurture. That's all that these stories are supposed to show to us. We shouldn't be quibbling about them, as again, the history of Christianity has done. It's terrible that these kinds of symbols were misused in this way. Wars were started over this. So, friends, I invite you today, when you feel that fear creeps in on you, when you feel that fear reduces you to nothing, when you've had losses, when you've had sickness, when friends have been sick, when you come to the end of your wits, that you don't believe the voice of the serpent, that you don't believe the message, oh, everything is gone, nothing is there, you'll never find something. And instead, that you question, that you talk back to that voice, and that you hold in mind that God actually, even at the end of this story, comes back in the garden and asks, where are you? But Adam and Eve are so caught up in fear that they try to hide. We don't have to hide. God does not chase us away. The God who chases us out of the garden is a figment of the serpent's imagination, is a figment of our fear of the scarcity principle. Let us not give in to fear. Let us hold paradise in mind. In paradise, we can be naked and not ashamed of it. You do not have to be ashamed. We do not have to be ashamed of being simply human. We do not have to be gods. We do not have to be perfect. We are accepted. And then the fear can come down. There's always nurture. There's always a hug. There's always love. There's always light. Amen.